It was a time when Israel was sinking into darkness, following the death of King Solomon. God's chosen people had slowly begun to forget him. Under the rule of Ahab, the worst king Israel had ever seen, the blood of innocent prophets stained the Holy Land. Hunted down and eliminated by his cruel wife, Jezebel, Israel had forgotten the very name of God. Instead, they knelt before altars of stone and wood, but God had not abandoned his people. Deep within the hills of Gilead, God was preparing an answer. From that forgotten, barren land emerged a man who would change history forever: Elijah. His very name held a promise of judgment and fire. My God is Yahweh. This is the story of the mightiest prophet who commanded the skies to close, called down fire from heaven itself, and never tasted death. But it is also the story of the man behind the prophet, his fears, his doubts, and his loneliness. Because Elijah was human, and his greatest battle wasn't against kings or armies, but against himself. Against his own doubts and the loneliness that consumed him from within until it broke him. For many years, Elijah had lived in his silence, hidden among the barren mountains. He was neither warrior nor priest. He wore garments made of camel hair. A thick beard covered his face, and his eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. But one day, God revealed to him his calling. The waiting was finally over. Elijah arose, descended from the mountains, and headed directly into the heart of corruption. Samaria, the capital city where King Ahab ruled alongside Jezebel. The soldiers stationed at the palace gates, upon seeing him approach, froze in place. Paralyzed by an unseen power, they let him pass, as if the air itself made way for him. Elijah walked through the throne room corridors without announcement and without escort. Servants retreated at each step. The columns of the palace, which had bowed to kings and ambassadors alike, now seemed to witness something entirely different. A wild prophet. No crown, no sword, striding forward as if driven by God himself. And there was Ahab, seated upon his throne, surrounded by counselors, idols, and vanity. Yet before he could even question who this stranger was, Elijah stood boldly before him and uttered words that would seal the kingdom's fate. As surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain during these years, except at my word. Silence fell like judgment. No one dared draw a breath. Elijah didn't wait for a response. He turned around abruptly and disappeared the way he had come. Ahab spoke not a word. He didn't order Elijah seized nor curse him. He just sat there, motionless. And then it began. Suddenly, the clouds started vanishing. The air turned dry, and the sky above began to close up like a door sealed shut from on high. As Elijah departed, God spoke to him again, saying, "Leave this place, go eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have commanded ravens to feed you there." Elijah obeyed without hesitation and headed east, while the land dried up in his wake. The cool breeze ceased, and the dew which had moistened the fields of Israel each morning fell no more. The sun scorched the fields, and what once had been a proud and fertile nation began to wither. Judgment had already started, and for 3 long years, not a single drop of rain would touch the earth. But as the kingdom entered drought, Elijah traveled across hills and valleys until he found that hidden place. Cherith. The brook. Cherith lay concealed between the dry hills near the Jordan, a thin ribbon of water slicing the earth like a scar, snaking its way among dry rocks and dusty bushes. Elijah settled into this hidden oasis deep within the desert, where with every sunrise and every sunset, a miracle unfolded. At dawn, as the sun began to stir in the east, a fluttering of wings would suddenly break the silence of the sky. Ravens, black-feathered birds, would appear along the horizon, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. They would settle near the prophet, place the food before him, and then, taking flight once more, vanish into the sky. They were birds considered unclean by law, creatures despised by men. Yet these were the ones chosen by God to deliver nourishment. Morning and evening alike, when the hills were painted amber by the sun's fading light, in profound solitude, Elijah ate in silence and drank from the brook, watching days melt into weeks, and weeks lengthen into months. This drought, like a silent curse, spread its dark shadow over all of Israel. The wells ran dry, the fields became barren, and animals collapsed exhausted onto the cracked earth. From his throne, Ahab screamed orders in desperation to find the man responsible for his ruin. Yet no news ever came. Elijah remained hidden by the brook, yet gradually he noticed something changing. The stones, once submerged, now emerged like islands along the riverbed. The once powerful current reduced to a thin trickle. The drought he himself had prophesied was finally reaching him. Until one morning, when he bent down to drink, he found no water, only the dampness between stones. The brook, Cherith, had dried up. But Elijah neither panicked nor complained. He simply held on to his faith and waited. Until at last, God's voice spoke clearly. "Arise, go to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow there to care for you." The Lord was sending him into dangerous territory, to Zarephath, the very homeland of Jezebel, the queen who had vowed to wipe out all his prophets. But Elijah did not hesitate. He stood, wrapped his cloak around him tightly, and began walking. The journey was grueling. The sun relentlessly battered cracked fields and lifeless trees. The drought spared nothing, and all living things seemed bowed beneath the very judgment Elijah himself had proclaimed. When Elijah finally reached the gates of Zarephath, suddenly he saw her, a frail woman, dressed in rags, picking up dry sticks. Her face weary, her hands cracked, and her eyes defeated. Something deep within his spirit confirmed it. This was the widow. Elijah approached, his voice calm and his face weathered by the harsh sun and desert wind, and said, "Please bring me a bit of water in a jar so I may drink." The woman, not yet knowing who he was, turned obediently, but before she could take another step, Elijah continued, "And please, bring me a piece of bread in your hand." Then she stopped, her eyes lowered, and with a trembling voice she replied, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. All I have is a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil left in a pitcher. I was gathering a few sticks to prepare one last meal for myself and my son. After that, we'll die." The woman stared at him in silence. She faced a choice: cling desperately to the little she had left, or let go and trust. She could die with dignity or obey and see what happened. She chose to believe, not in Baal, nor the idols of her people, nor even her own instincts. She chose to believe the word of a stranger, a dusty wanderer whose eyes seemed to have witnessed more than any man could bear. She returned home, lit the fire, poured the flour, mixed in the oil, and baked. And when she came back to the jar, the flour was still there, and the oil never ran dry. That day, all three of them ate, she, her son, and Elijah. And again, the next day, and the next, and on for many days. But suddenly, the widow's son fell ill. At first, it was just a fever. Then each breath grew shallower until, within hours, the child stopped breathing. The mother sank to her knees, broken from the inside out. The same man who had brought life into her household now seemed to have brought death. "Have you come to remind me of my sins?" she cried out to him in tears. "Have you come just to kill my son?" Elijah gave no response. He took the boy gently in his arms, carried him to the upstairs room where he had stayed, laid him upon the bed, and cried out to heaven. "My Lord and my God," Elijah cried, "have you brought calamity even upon this widow who welcomed me into her home by taking away her son?" Then he did something that no prophet had done before. Elijah stretched himself out 3 times over the boy, as if hoping to pour his own life into the child's body, and pleaded desperately, "Oh Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." There was a long silence, heavy, unbearable, until finally the boy's chest rose, his lips parted, and breath returned to his body. Elijah carried the living boy down the stairs, presented him to his mother, and said, "See, your son is alive." At that very instant, the widow regained more than her son. She regained her faith. With tears streaming down her face, she said, "Now I truly know that you are a man of God, and the words of the Lord from your lips are true." In a pagan land where altars burned for gods carved from stone and flame, a spark of true faith had now been lit. But still, the drought had not ended. For 3 whole years, not a drop of rain fell, and God's judgment had stretched across Israel like an open wound. Livestock vanished, wells dried up, and harvests became only a memory. First, hunger struck the poor, but soon even the wealthy felt its bite. Yet in all that despair, not everyone bowed down to Baal. Among those steadfast few was Obadiah, King Ahab's steward, who had witnessed the king's cruelty but refused to stand by quietly. Amid Ahab's persecution and slaughter of the Lord's priests and prophets, Obadiah did the unthinkable. He hid 100 prophets of God in 2 caves, 50 in each, and secretly fed them bread and water every single day. He risked his life out of love for his God. He even managed to keep it hidden from King Ahab, maintaining the king's trust. One morning, the king gave Obadiah an order: travel through the land, search for grass, springs, any stream not yet dried up. Perhaps we can save our horses and mules. Maybe something is still alive. Obadiah went out into the ruined kingdom, crossing barren and lifeless fields, when suddenly he saw him. There, amidst the dusty road, stood Elijah, tall, unwavering, his eyes burning like ancient fire. Obadiah fell to the ground and cried out, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," the prophet replied. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah stood up slowly. Fear stole his breath, and his eyes revealed his deep anguish. "What have I done that you'd put my life in danger if I go and tell Ahab you're here, and then the Spirit of the Lord takes you somewhere else and he can't find you?" He'll kill me." Then Obadiah leaned closer and confessed his secret to Elijah. "I've served the Lord faithfully since my youth. When Jezebel went around killing the prophets, I hid 100 of them in caves and fed them myself. I've done everything I could, Elijah, and now you ask this of me?" But Elijah stood firm, replying, "As surely as the Lord of hosts lives, whom I serve, I will stand before Ahab today." Obadiah knew he stood before a man who spoke as though heaven itself backed his words, and he obeyed. With his heart racing, he returned to the palace and spoke the words nobody expected to hear. "Elijah has returned. The prophet who sealed the heavens shut, who humbled the king before his very throne, and vanished as quickly as he appeared, had finally returned." Without hesitation, Ahab got onto his chariot and set out toward the appointed place. The sun blazed over dry, barren fields the moment the two men met. And it was Ahab who broke the silence with disdain. "Is that you, troublemaker of Israel?" But Elijah met his gaze and replied firmly, "I'm not the one troubling Israel, but rather you and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commands of the Lord and have chosen to follow Baal." Then Elijah boldly issued the challenge, "Now summon all Israel to Mount Carmel. Bring along the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asher who dine at Jezebel's table. Today, we will see who truly is God." Ahab agreed to the test, and the showdown began. The news spread quickly throughout all Israel, and thousands climbed from every corner of the kingdom toward Mount Carmel. Elders and youths, priests and soldiers, farmers and shepherds. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. At the summit, tension filled the air. On one side stood nearly 1,000 prophets of Baal and Asher, dressed in flashy robes and adorned with pagan symbols. On the other side stood Elijah, alone, wrapped in a cloak, worn thin by the sun and wind. The prophet raised his voice and sorrowfully asked the people, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if it's Baal, then follow him." The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their altar, cut up their bull, and laid it upon the dry wood. Then began a gruesome spectacle. From morning until noon, the 450 prophets screamed, leapt, and danced wildly around their altar, calling out to Baal. But there was no reply, not even the slightest sign. Baal remained utterly and embarrassingly silent. The sun climbed to its highest point, and Elijah, observing the tragic scene, began mocking them sarcastically. "Shout louder. Maybe Baal is busy or he's wandered off somewhere. Perhaps he's sleeping, and you need to wake him up." In wild desperation, they screamed even louder, intensifying their grim performance by cutting themselves until blood flowed freely. Afternoon drifted slowly across Mount Carmel, yet still no answer came. No fire descended. The crowd began to whisper, and Baal's powerlessness was made clear before the eyes of all Israel. Now it was Elijah's turn. Weary and disappointed, the people gathered close around him. Silently, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord. Carefully, he arranged the wood and placed the sacrifice upon it. Then he asked the impossible in the midst of the drought, commanding them to bring 4 jars full of water and pour it over the sacrifice. They did it once, then twice, and finally a third time, until the altar was thoroughly soaked, and water filled the trench surrounding it. Then, standing before all the people, the prophet lifted his eyes toward heaven and cried out, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let them see today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that all I have done has been at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people may know you alone are God, and that you are drawing their hearts back to you." A brief, yet profound silence followed his prayer. Suddenly, fire blazed from heaven, a scorching flame, alive and fierce, that consumed the sacrifice instantly, along with the wood, the stones, even the water itself, leaving behind only dust and reverent silence. Falling to their knees, the people acknowledged the true God, crying out in awe, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" At that moment, there was no doubt. Yahweh had answered, not Baal. Elijah's spiritual authority was unmistakably proven, and the crowd finally understood that the drought had come as a direct consequence of abandoning the Lord. The land of Israel at last had begun to be purified. As the people watched this decisive moment unfold, Elijah suddenly felt something in his spirit that he hadn't sensed in 3 years. The distant whisper of coming rain, a sound no one else could yet hear, but one the prophet knew would soon be obvious to everyone. Then Elijah climbed once more to the mountain and began to pray fervently, determined with the faith of someone who truly knows the God he serves. Beside him stood his servant, awaiting instructions. "Go up and look toward the sea," Elijah ordered. The young man ran, looked, returned, and answered breathlessly, "There's nothing there." Elijah remained still, and with firm conviction insisted, "Go back and look again." The servant went a second time and saw nothing. He went a third time, a fourth, 6 times he returned with the same news. "I see nothing, sir." Yet Elijah refused to quit. He continued pouring out his heart, knowing God was not finished yet. The 7th time, the young servant ran back excitedly, exclaiming in wonder, "Now I see a small cloud rising from the sea, no larger than the palm of a hand." For Elijah, that was enough. He quickly stood up and commanded, with urgency, "Go tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and hurry down before the rain stops him." In just a few minutes, that small cloud grew larger. The sky quickly turned dark, and from the horizon came a powerful wind. The people lifted their eyes in awe. After 3 long years, heavy drops began to fall upon the dry land. Within moments, the gentle drizzle transformed into a torrential downpour, soaking the thirsty earth and forming new streams rushing through the cracked and barren ground. Ahab quickly climbed onto his chariot and started down toward Jezreel, driven onward by the heavy rain, now saturating everything around him. But then something extraordinary happened. The hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. The prophet tucked his cloak into his belt and began to run. Not as an ordinary man would, but with supernatural speed, propelled forward by the very power of God. Before the king's astonished eyes, the prophet outran the horses, running through the storm as if carried by the rushing wind itself. It was an image of incredible power. The man who had closed the heavens now running ahead of the king, clearly displaying who truly ruled over Israel. "May the gods punish me severely if by this time tomorrow I don't do to you exactly what you did to each of them." When Elijah heard these words, fear gripped his heart, darker and deeper than he'd ever known. The very prophet who had bravely stood before hundreds on Mount Carmel and called down fire from heaven now trembled before one woman's wrath. Without thinking, without seeking God's counsel, he fled. He ran southward, leaving behind the very people who had just begun to return to God, leaving behind his appointed mission. Blinded completely by fear, he passed through fields and mountains, never stopping, never looking back, like a man pursued by death itself. At last, he reached the wilderness, alone and utterly exhausted. There, under the thin shade of a broom tree, the prophet collapsed to the ground. With tears he could no longer hold back, he cried out bitterly toward heaven, "Enough, Lord. Take my life now, for I am no better than my ancestors." Those words burst forth from the deepest part of his soul. Elijah, the great prophet, had reached rock bottom. All his strength, faith, and courage seemed to have evaporated under the ruthless heat of the desert. And there, beneath the sparse shade of the tree, he wished only to close his eyes forever. It wasn't merely Jezebel's threat that had broken him, but also the unbearable loneliness, the heavy burden of feeling he alone was faithful, and the deep disappointment that after all his struggles, nothing appeared to have changed. Yet there, deep in the desert, in the darkest moment of his life, God did not abandon him. Again, he drifted into sleep, hoping to escape his pain once more. But the angel returned once more, patiently and compassionately touched him, and spoke again in a calm but firm voice. "Get up and eat, for you still have a long journey ahead." These words echoed deeply within Elijah's weary heart. The prophet who had fled in despair now moved toward an even closer, deeper encounter with God. There upon that mountain, at the same spot where centuries earlier God had spoken face to face with Moses, Elijah would discover something new. For Elijah was human, deeply, profoundly human. Under that broom tree, Elijah came to understand that God doesn't only use people who are strong. Instead, he lifts up those who are broken. For in our deepest weakness, God's greatest works begin. That meal gave Elijah an unexplainable strength. He stood up and began his journey toward Horeb. Elijah's voice sounded fragile and weary, like that of a man who had struggled alone far too long. But God answered without reproach, simply inviting him to step out of the cave and stand upon the mountain, because the Lord himself was about to pass by. Suddenly, a fierce wind arose, so powerful that it tore the rocks apart and shook the entire mountain. As he listened to these words, the prophet's heart again began to beat strongly. He was not alone. He had never been alone. God had preserved a faithful remnant, hidden and protected, waiting for just the right moment to come forward. Their ministry, their purpose, had not been in vain. God had given him clear directions, whom to anoint, whom to prepare. Among those names, one stood out with special purpose: Elisha, son of Shaphat. And so he went to the fields where Elisha worked with his own hands. Elisha was neither priest nor prophet. He was a farmer. He was plowing the ground with 12 yoke of oxen, guiding the 12th himself. His hands were toughened by labor, his cloak covered in dust, his back bent from daily toil. But God had noticed him. Elijah approached him silently, removed his cloak, and placed it onto Elisha. This simple gesture spoke volumes. It was the unmistakable sign of divine calling, the passing of holy purpose, and the beginning of a new destiny. Elisha stopped. He felt the weight of the cloak resting upon his shoulders and instantly realized what it meant. In that moment, he knew his life had changed forever. He ran after Elijah, asking for one final act of compassion. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will follow you." Without emotion or pressure, Elijah replied, "Go back then. Don't you realize what I've just done to you?" Then something radical happened. Elisha returned to the fields, but not to stay. He took the yoke of oxen he'd been working with and slaughtered them. Then he took the plow, the wood, and the tools of his trade and set them ablaze. Upon this makeshift altar, he cooked the meat and shared it with the people in his village. He burned his past. He left nothing to return to. He gave himself no excuses, no safety net. He left everything behind and followed Elijah. And from that day forward, Elisha became his servant. Years had passed since the fire on Mount Carmel, and the people of Israel seemed to have forgotten the warning. Israel returned to its old routines, and Ahab, despite having seen the power of God firsthand, continued to rule as if nothing had changed. He remained a weak king, controlled by a ruthless woman, Jezebel. In Samaria, Ahab had everything a king could wish for: palaces, gardens, gold, servants. Yet deep inside, his heart coveted something more. And she did. With cold cruelty, she wrote letters in the king's name, sealed them with his royal seal, proclaimed a fast, and had Naboth seated in a place of honor. But next to him, two wicked men took their seats, and before the entire gathering, falsely accused Naboth. Naboth has cursed God and the king. Without trial or defense, Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death, his crime, standing up for what belonged to him. When the news reached Jezebel, she smiled with satisfaction and told Ahab, "Get up and seize the vineyard. Naboth is no longer alive." Ahab went to admire his new land, pleased like a spoiled child, believing he had won. But as he wandered through the vineyard, Elijah suddenly appeared, his face hardened with judgment. The king trembled at his sight and asked, "So you have found me, my enemy?" But an arrow shot at random, pierced through his armor, striking exactly at its weakest point. As the battle raged on, Ahab lay quietly bleeding inside his chariot until finally died at sunset. And when they washed his chariot, dogs licked up his blood, just as Elijah had prophesied. Thus died Ahab, the worst king Israel had ever known, and his son Ahaziah took his place on the throne. It wasn't long before Ahaziah followed the same corrupt path his parents had paved, and one day Ahaziah fell through a lattice from an upper window of his palace in Samaria. Elijah obeyed, and the message quickly reached the palace. Surprised, Ahaziah asked them, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you?" They answered, "He was a man wearing a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist." And Ahaziah knew immediately it was Elijah the Tishbite. The king's anger blazed, and he sent a captain with 50 soldiers to arrest him. They found the prophet sitting calmly atop a hill, and the captain shouted arrogantly, "Man of God, the king commands you to come down." But Elijah replied quietly, "If I truly am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And then it happened. A roar tore through the heavens. Flames fell and consumed the captain and his soldiers in an instant, Their cries faded, reduced to ashes. Ahaziah, stubborn in his rebellion, sent another captain with another 50 men. The result was the same: fire, judgment, death. Yet the third captain was different. He came without orders or threats. He fell to his knees, lifted his hands, and pleaded, "Man of God, I beg you, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight." And this time, the voice of God spoke to Elijah. "Go down with him. Do not be afraid." His time on earth was finished, but his farewell would not happen in silence, nor would he face it alone. From Gilgal, the prophet began his final journey. Elijah arose early that morning. The desert breeze felt gentler than usual, and the sun had not yet fully risen, but already Elijah had set out on his journey. Before Jehu could even reply, the young prophet vanished like a whisper into the shadows. Jehu walked back out to his men, his head dripping with oil and fire blazing in his eyes. His companions watched him expectantly. What did that madman want? What did he say to you? Jehu hesitated at first, but then, gazing resolutely into their eyes, spoke boldly. "He has anointed me king over Israel." Immediately they rose up, each man laying his garment beneath Jehu's feet as a sign of allegiance, and blowing their trumpets, they shouted loudly, "Jehu is king." And at that moment, the revolution began. "Have you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master?" she mocked him, shouting from her palace window. Jehu looked up and called out to the people below, "Who will stand with me?" 2 or 3 officials appeared at the window, and Jehu commanded them, "Throw her down, toss her out." It wasn't just a promise, it was a warning. This means the story of Elijah, the prophet who never died, is still not over. According to Scripture, he will come again, and when he does, the world must be ready. From Elijah, we learn that God also walks with us and holds us up when we break. We learn that even the bravest fall, that even the most faithful servants sometimes feel fear, and that even prophets can feel alone, empty, and close to collapse. And now this story calls out to you. Yes, you. Perhaps you've journeyed through doubts, fears, or moments of profound spiritual exhaustion. Have you ever felt like the struggle is just too much? Like you're alone? Like the world around you has forgotten God? Maybe you, just like Elijah, have felt the urge to hide under a broom tree, wishing to simply give up. Listen closely. God isn't finished with you yet. When Elijah was exhausted and had no strength left, God didn't abandon him, nor did he scold him for falling down. Instead, he fed him, touched him, and strengthened him. And afterwards, he spoke to him again. Maybe you're in that same place right now, wounded inside and weary. Today, God is calling you, because if there's one thing we learn from Elijah, it's that God doesn't pick the perfect. He chooses the willing, the ones who listen in faith. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's wrestling with doubts or feeling alone, share this video with them. It just may be exactly what they need today. Please support this video by giving it a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more life-changing Bible stories coming soon. Blessings to you and your family.